Good morning, everyone in Asia, and good afternoon or evening if you're joining us from elsewhere. Uh, I'm Ed Green, Director of IRCOS, and some of you look familiar to me and others are new. It's our pleasure to welcome you to this wonderful evening event with Suzie Boss. Suzie has published some 10 books to help educators learn how to think a little differently about their classrooms and using technology and working through interdisciplinary modes. I think in the next hour or so, we're going to be exposed to some really good thinking, and look forward to also the second session, which is a week from now. I just want to thank Suzie for finding time to join us, and turn it over to you, Suzie. Thank you so very much for giving us your time this evening or this morning. Yeah, but welcome everybody. If you have questions, pop them into the chat room, depending on how Suzie wants to run the session, but we will have time for Q&A at the very end of the session as well. So thank you again for joining us, and Suzie, it's all yours.
Okay. Thanks so much, Ed, for the welcome and for the invitation to join all of you. I'm going to share my screen and we will be underway here. Okay. Give me a thumbs up quickly if you can see what I'm hoping you're seeing. Yep. Okay. Looks like we're doing the right thing in the right place. So that's all good. So we're going to dig into this topic of interdisciplinary learning. And connecting the learning that's happening for your students with what they consider the real world. I think school is part of the real world too, but for students, sometimes the world is what happens outside the classroom. So let's explore this a little bit. Let's start by finding out where all of you are joining from. This lovely photo is my home state of Oregon. I live in Portland, Oregon, upper left corner of the US there. And spring is coming. And to tell you just a little bit about how much of a project-based learning person I've become over the decades, this becomes my filter for everything. So I visit this beautiful tulip farm near my home, and I think immediately of a project called the Journey North that some of you may have experienced with your students over the years about seasonal change. So I think once you start putting on your project-based lenses, the whole world becomes project potential. So as you're adding to the chat, please tell us a little bit about where you're joining from, what your role is. We'd love to start finding out about each other a little bit. And I'll tell you that although I'm based in the US, usually when we're not in the middle of a pandemic and travel is not restricted, I'm all over the world working with teachers who want to shift to more student-centered project-based learning. This photo happens to be from my first trip to India, which was more than a decade ago now, and have been back multiple times over the years, and all across Asia, Europe, South America. I've been spending most of my travel time recently on Zoom in situations like this, and I'm just itching to get back out there again. So starting to look ahead to how the world may be opening up. I'm going to open my chat window so that I can see. So South Korea, Thailand, fantastic. Okay, great. We're going to keep this chat open because we want to stay connected and be as interactive as we can in our time together today. So let's think a little bit about what's ahead. Today, we're going to really focus on why you might want to do interdisciplinary projects. What's your why? Really thinking about opportunities. Sometimes when we bring up this subject with teachers, they start thinking about why they can't do it. I'm going to ask you to hold that thought for today and swim in the land of opportunity. Really think about what if we did? What if we were able to bring more interdisciplinary learning to our students? What might be the benefits for them? What might that look like? And then next week, we'll get to some of those concerns that teachers sometimes have or challenges they might have to designing and implementing cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary learning with their students. So we'll get to the challenges, but for today, Give yourself permission to really think about opportunities rather than why this might not work for your students. And in between sessions, you'll get an email from Christine or from Ed, and it will share some resources for you to help you think about where to go next. And some of the resources I'll talk about today will be in that handout for you. So again, a quick question for you for the chat. I'm curious what your experience with project-based learning is. Not necessarily interdisciplinary projects, but project-based learning generally. So I've developed a little shortcut over the years that helps me get some insight. And just add to the chat where you think you land on these 4 choices. Are you that's somebody who I would consider an armchair traveler? Maybe you're reading up about project-based learning and you're curious, but you haven't really set off on a journey yet with your students. You're still kind of wondering, is this a good trip for me to take with my students? Or maybe you're B, where you're just doing your first projects this year. So I would call you a tenderfoot in my lingo. Maybe you've done several projects, you're kind of finding your way with this. Now you've got different and perhaps deeper questions, and maybe you're ready to stretch a little bit your own learning edges and your students' learning edges. If you're an explorer, that's option C. And D are the scouts, the people who have done enough of this that they can teach and guide others, whether they're in a leadership role or whether they are just a great colleague in your content area or your grade level team. I'm seeing everything A, B, and C here well represented. Looks like we've got folks, just like any good classroom, quite a spread. So wherever you're at on your journey, I'm hoping that you're going to find some resources and some ideas today to kind of stretch your thinking a little bit, take you a little further. It's great to see that we've got lots of folks who have some PBL experience, but also some who are brand new to this. So we'll have a chance to learn a little bit together. So knowing that we've got an interesting group, let's come to some common language about interdisciplinary or cross-connected learning. I think common language is really critical as we think about designing something together, as we think about learning experiences. When we talk about project-based learning, we want to be talking about the same thing. And the definition that really resonates for me when it comes to connected learning, connected content areas, comes from the folks at Project Zero. And they landed on this definition, as you can see, quite a while back. There was a big research deep dive they did into interdisciplinary studies early on with Project Zero at Harvard. And what I really like about their definition is that it involves learning deeply, thinking deeply, acquiring knowledge in one or more disciplines for the purpose of doing something, creating something of value. And that creation couldn't have been possible if you hadn't made those connections. So you need both ways of thinking coming together to create something. And this is the definition that I'm going to be relying on today when I talk about, and I'm going to use the term interdisciplinary. I know there are lots of terms that describe similar ways of learning, a few of them listed at the top there. But this is the language that I'd like us to use today as we think about the kinds of learning experiences that let students bring together 2 or more really expert ways of thinking and apply it in order to create a product or solve a problem. And you know, the getting to why we want to do this is going to be my next question for all of you. I'm going to share a little bit of my own thinking. When I work with teachers on project design or schools that are shifting toward project-based learning, we often do that imagining your future graduate sort of activity. If any of you have gone through visioning work, or if you've developed a portrait of a learner for your school or a portrait of a graduate, you've probably gone through something similar, imagining what is it I want my students to know and be able to do by the end of their learning experience with me. And the same sorts of words come up in all kinds of contexts all around the globe. The ones that you see, you know, on the right side of your screen here are the competencies that I think most educators realize our students are going to need, because we live in a world that's going to involve a lot of problem solving. We're seeing it every day if you're paying attention to the news. COVID, more than anything, has taught us the need to bring different ways of thinking together in order to solve really complex problems and be able to communicate well and collaborate across cultures. All of those things have been really critical. So the world that our students are entering and are part of now and will become contributing adults in, it's a project-based world. The problems that they're going to be facing, the opportunities that they're going to be part of, don't happen in silos. They don't happen in really discrete ways of understanding. It's going to require specialization and bringing good ideas together to solve problems. So in really broad strokes, I think that's one of the whys for interdisciplinary projects. But there are some other factors, forces at work here. Many of your schools I know are IB schools, and there are already some changes in the IB expectations. The learner profile is about applying thinking skills. It doesn't say in one discipline, but in order to solve problems, that may mean needing to bring ideas together. A lot of the IB program is already thematic and interdisciplinary and connected. And it definitely some changes. I've gotten a glimpse of what's coming up in the IB biology expectations. So this idea of needing to apply knowledge, make connections across content area is going to become more important. Some of the other academic pressures toward interdisciplinary or learning have to do what colleges are looking for. As colleges get used to seeing things like portfolios of student work or mastery transcripts or alternatives to traditional test scores, they're looking to see what can students do? What can they actually do by applying what they know? And chances are those are going to be problems students have solved or opportunities they've taken advantage of that connect across content areas. Some of our experts in the world, people like Daniel Pink, talk about the importance of looking at the world through wide apertures. If you're a school that has looked at the work of Tony Wagner or folks like Ted Dintersmith or other thinkers about education, you know that this is a really common refrain, getting students out of the kind of siloed ways of thinking and into a more connected way of approaching the world. And particularly, I think for international schools, which do such a great job of focusing on their students as global citizens. And of course, they are global citizens. Developing their global competency requires being able to understand different cultures, bring ideas together. So it's not a luxury, but a necessity, as our expert thinker here shares with us. So there are, lots of whys. Feel free to use the chat if you'd like to think about your why a little bit. I'm going to kind of continue on just in the interest of keeping our conversation moving, but the chat is your place to connect. So feel free to keep using that. If there's a why for engaging your students in the kind of learning we're going to be talking about today, feel free to share that. And I'm just going to keep moving along here. So I'll keep an eye on the chat as we kind of continue. I think in a nutshell, what really matters for real world projects, the sorts that are interdisciplinary, that draw on different domains, are thinking of these two things together, thinking deeply within one discipline and also connecting across disciplines. So because something's interdisciplinary, you still need to think about, how does a mathematician think? How does an historian think? And then you make the connections, bringing into that, how does an artist think? Or how does a scientist think? So you're going to go deeply within your disciplines, and you're also going to make some connections across disciplines. The thinking is going to get applied to actually do something. So you're going to take that great knowledge that students have developed by thinking deeply, and they're going to solve a problem, or they're going to create a product, or come up with a solution, and perhaps explain it to someone else. So this combination of thinking and doing are right at the heart. Greg, I appreciate your comment that this is engaging for students. This is what helps them find meaning. So I couldn't agree more about the engagement factor of helping students really tackle problems that are messy. And I love seeing comments like joy, the joy of learning, Katie. I couldn't agree with you more. So keep those comments coming. Those are great. I'm going to share a few examples of what kind of the difference is when you go from a single discipline or an activity in one discipline to something that is connected and that brings these ways of thinking together to create something new, something you couldn't do unless you were thinking across disciplines. So here's a project with some young learners, some elementary students who were learning about the forces of flight. And to kick off this project, they went to their local airport and they began interviewing adults who were about to get on planes. And they asked them the simple question, why do planes stay up in the sky? Most adults couldn't answer that. And you can imagine perhaps a little nervous making among those adults as they were thinking about getting on a plane and they didn't really know what keeps planes aloft. They trusted there was science behind this, and some of them mumbled around with an answer, but they hadn't really learned deeply about the forces of flight and what drag means and lift. But these students had, and they were embarking on this investigation of the forces of flight. And they were going to learn deeply about the science of this, but then to educate these poor adults who didn't understand about the forces of flight, they were going to create an art exhibit for the airport that they were going to curate, explaining how artists also use similar forces, how gravity and flow, affect art making. They study different artists who used various forces, force and motion, to create their art. They made a public exhibit, and their curation went deeply into both the scientific knowledge that they had gained and the artistic techniques that demonstrated the use of these forces. So this, for me, is a really nice example of young learners being able to bring together two very disparate fields, science and art, to create something that they couldn't have done if they didn't really understand kind of both sides of that equation. Another example might be coming from bringing together civics or global studies, social studies, and data literacy, really looking deeply at things like statistics or what experts sometimes call geoliteracy, understanding how a problem exists in place. How would you map a problem and how it affects different populations or different regions differently. So imagine students doing some mapping of a problem that they had investigated and cared about, and then using that as data to present a solution to decision makers. That example, these students had investigated safer ways to get to school. They found that after interviewing students, what was their walking route to school, those who walked, lots of dangers along that route for some high school students. And they came up with a presentation to decision makers who had their access to the budget to come up with safer ways to get there. We've seen this sorts of project where students are investigating their campus and its carbon footprint. They look at the data, measure the data around their campus, come up with proposals that really require them to understand how do decisions get made. So they have to understand the environmental science, but they also have to understand how policy happens and how to make a really great argument backed by evidence. So students using their data literacy, using statistics that they've gathered, using perhaps infographics that they've created to explain the data, using that in a presentation to decision makers where they're trying to affect policy. It's another kind of example. One more that I'll share with you. Imagine doing a book study on this very popular book that lots of elementary students read, A Long Walk to Water. You could do that just as a really nice, rich literacy experience, right? You can have book circles, you can have book talks, you can have students create different products related to their understanding, really work on their literacy skills and all of that. But imagine the benefits if they also connected this with social studies and perhaps with STEM activities. If they were thinking about the issue of acquiring safe drinking water, how that connects to the UN global goals, what could they make or advocate or propose that would enable better access to clean water. So you've gone beyond a great story about access to drinking water, clean water, and now you've gone into the realm of solutions and having students really think about themselves either as designers of perhaps technologies for accessing clean water, or advocating for organizations that are doing this work and kind of enhancing their message. So lots of different ways that a project like this could go if you went beyond book study and thought about how can we really connect this with the bigger issue and what could students do about it? Because often students will read a book like this, or they'll encounter a topic like this, and they'll be motivated and want to do something. So it's that impulse to want to act, to take action that you want to leverage to really get to the full benefits of projects like this. So as you're thinking about these sorts of projects, I know most of you are probably already using some sort of a unit planner. I know various schools use PYP planners or understanding by design. As you think about how you do instructional planning now, ask yourself, does this allow for, does it allow room for project-based learning? The graphic that you see here is one of the frameworks for project-based learning that I'm most familiar with, because I helped do a lot of the work to develop it and write about it. This comes from a group in the US, but with global reach, called PBL Works. And I've shared resources that you'll get after the session if you want to dig into this a little bit more. You may already be familiar with this, but when I've worked with teachers who are using a different kind of a unit planner, and we try to shift to project-based learning, they need to do a little crosswalk between how are you planning now and what's really required of planning to get to an authentic project. So you might look at this framework and think, well, yeah, we've got inquiry in this project. We're doing inquiry or inquiry, as my international school friends remind me, it's a better way to pronounce it. But is it authentic? Are students really doing real world things? Do they have voice and choice? Is there going to be a public product at the end of this? The learning goals that you've identified, maybe in a more traditional unit planner, might be strictly academic. Are there additional learning goals that you want to reach for? Things like collaboration or communication to get those ideas out into the world. So as you're thinking about how do you plan units now, how do you plan your lessons and longer units of study, what's missing that might make projects more meaningful and more impactful and allow for this sort of application of knowledge in ways that might be interdisciplinary? The other thing I think that's important to think about is when you're going to make the connections in a project. I'm going to share with you in a moment some strategies for thinking a little bit differently about when and how you might make these connections. But this flow is how most projects unfold with your students, regardless of content area, regardless of grade level. If you're doing a well-designed project, you start in some way that ignites their interest. Either you're starting with a question that they've come up with and you've worked on together to make sure it connects to your learning goals, or you're doing a launch event, a way to hook their interest right off the bat, and get them asking questions that are going to be the questions that open up that content that you want to explore with them. So you go from that launch event to another phase where you're using their questions to build their knowledge and really deepen their understanding. The questions that they've asked in that launch event, now you're going to investigate with them and guide them, facilitate their learning through often some very traditional teaching methods can come into play here. Once they've built that knowledge and understanding, they're going to apply it to come up with a solution or a product or something that demonstrates what they know and can do. And then finally, they're going to share that with an audience. It doesn't have to be a huge audience. It might be one really important person, but in some way, they're going to take their learning and extend it beyond the classroom. That's kind of the basic flow of project-based learning, whether you're doing it in one content area or in a connected content area. But as you think about along these four phases, there are different ways that you can add interdisciplinary connections. It doesn't have to be all at once. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. So I'm going to share with you a continuum I've come up with that I hope is going to spark your thinking a little bit. And we'll talk about this, and then we're going to, after that, shift to a little bit of a breakout time for you to talk with your colleagues and do a little processing of what we're talking about. So here's my suggested continuum for you to think about when it comes to interdisciplinary project planning. can be all in. I'm going to talk about each of these in just a moment, or you're really combining both content areas all the time throughout the project. But it doesn't have to be. It can be what I call the just-in-time connection, where at a particular moment in the project, one of those 4 phases I was talking about is really necessary to bring in another way of thinking to proceed with the project, to meet the learning goals. Or it can be something very different called a handoff, where you start the project in one content area and then it shifts to another content area, kind of a to be continued, or the next phase in the learning adventure might happen in a class different from yours, might start with you and then go to someone else. And I've come up with this continuum because some teachers will talk about just the challenges of planning together. They don't have the space or the structures for the all-in kind of experience. So I wanted them to think about different ways to approach interdisciplinary planning so students still get this really rich experience of connecting their learning and doing something with it. So let's look at each one of these 3 and then give you a little chance to talk about them. So what do I mean by all-in? This is where you've got 2 or more content areas coming together, 2 or shared learning goals throughout the entire project, same students. So it might be happening in one class if it's an elementary class and one teacher is teaching all content area to the students. So you're self-contained and you've got your students all day and you're designing projects intentionally so that you're bringing together 2 or more content areas. Or you may be in a situation like the students at High Tech High, which is what this image is from, one of the best known project-based learning school networks now in the world. And all of their projects involve 2 or more content areas because the school is set up that way. They're designed for team teaching. They have long learning, blocks of time, a block schedule, so that there's enough time for teachers to work with a large group of students together. So 2 full class sizes together all the time in these very connected ways, and doing projects that are inherently connected. One of the resources I'll share with you is a really wonderful new book they've done with kind of the best of 20 years of these sorts of projects to inspire you and share with you some of the examples. But I think what's notable about it is that the projects in this book are not organized by content area. You don't look through it and say, what's a 5th grade, social studies project that we could do? They're really organized in a way that enables students to use what they're learning to apply their knowledge to do something, to make change in some sort of a way, which is why this is called changing the subject. So it's moving away from kind of strict content areas to these really interconnected, interdisciplinary learning experiences where students are change makers, where they're really solving problems and engaging with their community in some really powerful ways. Other ways that I've seen kind of the all-in approach, we see this a lot in PYP, the primary years projects. You see it in high school if you're set up for classes such as humanities, where you're bringing English and history together, or if you have electives like STEM or robotics, or if you have electives like environmental economics, for example, which I've seen in some schools, where you've got to bring together the environmental science and the economic theory in order for students to really come up with solutions as environmental economists. So there are existing structures that enable 2 or more teachers to plan together and to really design toward meeting content goals in 2 or more areas. So that's what I think of when I describe the all-in project, right? So same kids, same learning goals, 2 or more content areas. Lots of ways that can play out. But that doesn't always work for teachers. They don't always have this ability to have the same students at the same time with another teacher. They may be in a classroom where they're teaching one content area. I was really struck in a visit to the American International School in Chennai, and I was watching a history class, and they had just finished being part of National History Day, which is an annual event where students think in the way that historians do, and then they create products that are, their interpretation of history. So this particular class had done a really great job of first building students very deep disciplinary knowledge as historians. You can see this photo on the left is a little bit glary, but it's the building the historian's toolbox. What goes into the toolbox of a competent historian? How do they think? What's the narrative arc of a great historical narrative? How do historians come up with evidence and make arguments? They had done a lot of deep work in the discipline of history so that before students kind of went off in their own direction as historians to investigate something of interest to them, they had to do in this particular year of the contest, I think around World War II was the focus. They were ready to really think as historians, but they had a choice of different products to make to demonstrate what they knew and could do. The one that you see here uses some amazing visuals. This student got really interested in wartime photographer Margaret White, and created this really amazing exhibit that you wanted to just step right into. It's very 3D and has amazing photography. He had to understand a lot about photography and what makes for great photography and graphic design in order to be successful with that product. A different group of students took up the challenge that was offered to create a one-act play to explain their historical research through theater. Now, this history teacher was not a theater guy. He did not have the expertise he felt like he needed to coach students through writing and staging a one-act play. But just in time, he connected them with the theater teacher who helped them think in that way of thinking that theater people do about how do we take this story and bring it to life on the stage. It didn't have to be the history teacher's toolkit. He wanted them thinking as historians, but to get their story across, they needed to understand more about theater and writing for the stage and costuming and all the things that need to happen for a great one-act play. So this is what I think about how I describe the kind of just-in-time interdisciplinary connection. Not every student in the class learned about photography or learned about theater. Some other students made videos. Not every student needed those deep understandings of those content areas, but the ones who did got to explore those areas just in time in order to continue with the project and be successful with the project. A different project I remember learning about was a chemistry project where students were doing really serious work as chemists, coming up with solutions to keep lead out of drinking water. And they were doing all the work that chemists go through, designing experiments, gathering data, testing it. They came to the point in the project where they had done their experiments, they had this data, but they needed to analyze it. They needed to think in the way that statisticians think. Chemistry teacher's not a statistician. So what did he do? Just in time, brought in half a dozen statisticians of different ages and descriptions to work alongside students and help them work through this part of the project so that they could be successful in analyzing and explaining the data that they had gathered. So I think of this again as a just-in-time connection to another discipline. It was necessary for them to meet their learning goals, to be successful in the project. And interestingly enough, the experts that this chemistry teacher brought in included working statisticians, university folks, but they also included students who had been through his class before and understood enough about statistics to explain it to another group of students. So it was important, as he said, for his students to meet statisticians that they could relate to, that looked like them, or they could see themselves perhaps pursuing this in the future because it was interesting. So he tried to match gender and race and age and make sure that the experts really connected with students along with being truly experts in statistics. So as you think about project design, are there times in the project, those 4 phases of learning, where bringing in just-in-time connections is really going to make a difference for your students, for the depth of knowledge, for their ability to construct something or come up with a product or solution that's going to incorporate more than one discipline. And then finally, to really stretch your thinking, for any fancy thinkers with us today, I want to introduce you to the idea of a handoff. So what you see here starts in one class with one project and gets handed off to an entirely different class for the next phase. The first phase is some pretty serious scientific research. Students are doing quite intense. These are high school students, capable high school students, doing some really intense scientific medical research in collaboration with mentors from outside the school. So they're really going deep as scientists and as researchers. They finish their research project, and then picture this: they literally walk down the hall with their research brief, and they have to explain it to a class of art students because they want one of those artists to take their research and interpret it as an artist for an exhibit for the community. They've done all their thinking as scientists, but they want to go a step further in this project so that the research becomes more approachable, more interesting, more emotionally impactful for an audience than the kind of more dry dissertation that they've written. And so this project is what I think of as the handoff, where it starts in one class and then gets handed off to another to really go deeply with yet another discipline, to take the same body of knowledge and think about it in a different way. So you can see the quality of work here of, one student really investigating something around neurophysiology, but then an art student in an art class thinking about, how do I capture this? And then there are beautiful statements by both the student artist and the student researcher kind of explaining how did they approach this problem, one to research it and one to interpret it. Other ways that I've seen this handoff idea work, sometimes schools will have a tradition of a project that they do every year that students get really excited about. And each year it needs to be refreshed or perhaps go in a different way. It may be that your school has created a school garden, for example, or a museum type situation. Something that needs to be refreshed each year by fresh thinking and students tackling this in a different way. So that's another way that the handoff can happen, from one year literally to the next. We started it, you guys take it and run with it. What else can you do with this project idea that we began and have built a foundation on? Now it's up to the next group of you to take it forward. So as you think about these three possible contexts, different ways to integrate content areas, we're going to shift to breakouts just for a few minutes to give you a chance to talk about this a little bit with your colleagues. Let's just take 10 minutes in a breakout, and let's see if I can actually do this for us. Let's see, I'm looking for my breakout option here. And what I'd like you to do is just talk about, kind of where are you now with anything interdisciplinary or project-based, and where would you like to go next? How would your students benefit if you kind of push yourself into this land of opportunity and take this next step? So, Ed, how many folks do we have totally? 20, 25, something like that? So let me do some quick math. Okay, so we're going to create some rooms. We're going to just set you at random, and we'll bring you all back in about 10 minutes. But just have a little chat about what we've talked about so far, what's making sense to you, and what might be the benefits for your students if you go in this direction. So I'm going to hang out here, but I'll see you back in 10 minutes. Welcome back. We'll just give folks another moment here to rejoin us. Hope you had good conversations with your colleagues. They're using their last seconds here. It's good. Okay, a couple rooms are just about back. Okay. All right. Okay, so welcome back. I hope you had good conversations with your colleagues, being able to kind of think this through. How would this benefit your students? I think those are the really key things to think about. If you want to share any ahas from your group in the chat, please do that. I'd love to hear some little highlights of what came out of those conversations. And while you're doing that, I'm going to give you a little preview of what I'm going to be sending to you. You'll get an email after this session with a packet of resources. And I want to highlight a couple things that I hope will stretch your thinking a little bit more and things for you to explore a little bit if you want to go deeper into thinking about what could this look like for my students. One thing that I'm going to share with you are some highlights of my own, think of this forever as my COVID project. During the pandemic, I worked on a book project where we did all of our research by Zoom because, of course, we couldn't go anywhere. But my co-author, Ken Kay, and I were talking with schools that are really on the leading edge of transforming to really different and more compelling modes of teaching and learning. We wanted to find out what was happening, what were students actually doing. Not just what was the vision, but what was happening in the classroom that we're building these capable 21st century students. And 4 really big contexts came up that are kind of the core of our book. We call them field trips, where we describe each of these contexts in some detail and hear from students who are really interested in learning about and solving problems related to things like sustainability. We know that climate matters to our students. We know that their local environment really matters. And so a lot of very, what I would call place-based projects where students are investigating issues that have to do with environmental concerns right in their own neighborhoods and making change by bringing in expert ways of thinking. Invention was another hot topic in a lot of schools where students are coming up with products to solve problems. Some of them think of themselves as the next great, tech gazillionaire, and others are really just invested in making the world a better place through products, technology solutions. So we have lots of examples of that. Entrepreneurship, students who see ways to use business smarts to solve problems, to invest in their communities, to perhaps close some divides when it comes to wealth gaps by enabling people to be more successful in the business world. And finally, around civic engagement, we saw a lot of projects that had to do with students as citizens of their own communities, of their own schools, and also the wider world. So each of these 4 contexts sets the stage for interdisciplinary learning because they're not siloed. Sustainability is not just a science project. Entrepreneurship is not just a math project. You've got to bring in different ways of thinking. So there's lots of examples there. I also spent some time this past year on an interesting project that involved math and English teachers coming together for a series of conversations about themselves as civic educators. So they teach math, they teach English, they're in siloed areas, content areas in their schools, but they've realized through their collaboration, through their conversation with their colleagues, that they need to bring these ways of knowing and ways of thinking about issues in the world, they need to bring them together. They need to bridge the distance between math and between English. And what happens as a result is that students see themselves as civic actors, people who can learn about math by learning about social issues that they really care about, and then advocating for solutions or bringing more attention to issues that really matter to them. So I've shared a link. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail now, but there's a link to this guide where you'll hear a lot of teacher voices, like the teacher I'm quoting here, Ethan Weaker, who he told me, 20 years of math teaching, and he used to be a guy who only thought that his job was math, 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 all the time math. That's all we have time for. That's all we do. but something shifted in his teaching in recent years. And he stepped out of his siloed way of thinking and thought, my students need context. They need to understand math, where it lives in the world, and how they can use math to understand the world and maybe make change happen. So he began bringing a lot more contextual studies, still mathematical problem solving, but in the context of issues that students really care about, often social justice issues or things having to do with income inequality, things that are just rich with math. The pandemic raised all kinds of math-related issues. And so he just began infusing his students' studies of math with more context that has just made learning for them a lot richer, and helped him really grow again as a teacher. So that's another resource I've shared with you in the packet that you'll get. I've shared some links to PBL Works where you can see some project examples. If you just want to get inspired by some starter ideas and think about how could I adapt these, how could I borrow them to meet my needs, you can explore those at your leisure. A couple other ideas here for you for getting started with projects. Looking to your standards and thinking about, why do we teach these standards? Why are these our content goals? Who uses these ideas in the world? That's a great way to start thinking about application of knowledge. Not just learning about something, but learning about something so that you can use it to solve a problem or apply it in a context that really matters with you, to you and your students. So I shared some resources with you about getting started. A couple more things to think about is, kind of what's your context? Who are your thought partners? Who can you turn to say, I'm thinking about doing a project. It'd be great if we could bring our content areas together. Who is it in your grade level team or in different PLCs or lesson study groups in your school or data teams or the networks that you're part of? Who can you think together with? And I think the benefits for teachers are really rich when you can think through a project together. I talked to a couple teachers a while back whose students entered a podcast making competition. So something that happened in the US, it was a national competition, and this little tiny town in a rural area in the US wound up being the national winner the first time we had this competition. And I was really curious about the learning that had preceded their winning podcast. And it turned out to be an English teacher and a history teacher whose classes sat side by side. They had the same period where they, were teaching the same grade level at the same time. And they just decided, for this project, we're going to merge our students and merge our content goals. And we're going to think about, what do they need to understand as historians to gather stories that are worth telling? And then how do we communicate those stories in a way that's really effective? So that's where the language arts came into play. And it was a beautiful example of two content areas. So all the stories had to be well-crafted, well-told stories, but they had to be rich with history because that was the focus for this project. And the students who won told this amazingly crazy story about something that had happened in their town, small town, 100 years before, but so influenced the community that it, it had that staying power, the kind of story that sticks around. And they really explored, what did it mean to our community who've had this experience 100 years ago? Why does it still matter today? Why are we still telling this same story? And had to do with a circus elephant, of all things. Anyways, the benefit of that project was that these teachers really merged their thinking, and that they could not have, the students could not have produced such a quality piece of work if they hadn't gone deeply into both of their disciplines to really work toward excellence together. So be thinking about your thought partners, coming up with project ideas that are, going to be real world and impactful. It's hard work, and it really helps to have someone to think through that with. And sometimes it can really help to think through experts. Who is it outside of school who's using this content area I want my students to understand that could help guide this project, could lend their expertise, could mentor me maybe as a project teacher, or my students as they explore this content area that maybe isn't something I know about in great detail, but my students want to learn more about. So as you think again about experts, think about that continuum. Do you need experts with you all the time, or could they step in just at the right moment to keep the learning on track and keep it moving forward? Probably not so much with the handoff, but I know that some really nice expert collaborations are happening in international schools. The photo at the bottom is from Singapore American School, where students are working alongside working alongside mentors on very authentic projects that are not single siloed at all. They're very much interdisciplinary learning experiences. So think about who those experts might be. How could you connect with them? I've seen schools do everything from create a digital library of experts. Here are experts we've tapped in the past. Here's how they're good at working with students. Here's what they know about. Here's how to contact them. Imagine if you had that kind of resource available to you for project planning. So when you needed an expert to come in just in time to lend that deep knowledge of a discipline, you'd know who to reach and how to find them. Your parent community can be a really great starting point for building a database like that. And then finally, you want your students reflecting on their learning. Throughout the project, reflection is just embedded in project-based learning from start to finish. But at the end, it's really important to get them to think about, did we make a difference? All the great thinking and learning that we did in this project, kind of what did it add up to? How will we know if we've had impact? These are some students from the American School of Bombay, ASB in Mumbai, who did a project a few years ago called Project Impact. And we'll talk a little bit more about that next week, because the way it was designed really gave teachers that room to try out interdisciplinary planning and try out project-based learning with getting barriers out of the way. But I was struck by one of the students' comments that you don't have to do a big thing to have a real impact, to make a difference. They did something very specific and very impactful in their community, and they learned a lot along the way. So instead, let's see, I'm looking at our time here. Instead of going into breakouts again, what I want you to do is either go to this Padlet link now, or come back to it later. Again, this link is going to be in the materials that will be shared with you. But what we want to focus on next week, I hope today has gotten you thinking about, maybe inspired to try or imagine some different kinds of projects that let your students make these connections. But at the same time, we need to acknowledge the challenges. Coming up with great project ideas, implementing them in school systems that aren't necessarily set up for cross-disciplinary collaboration, that can be, there could be a lot of issues there. So here's a chance to share your concerns, your questions, challenges that you think might get in the way of interdisciplinary learning for your students, because that's going to be the focus for next week. And I'd really like to be responsive to what your concerns are as you think about what would this be like for my students? What would this be like for me? There's a question in that. I'm going to save time for questions in just a minute here. Patrick, we're going to come back to your question in just a second around finding those mentors and experts. But I'm going to give you just a minute to make sure you have this link. If you want to add to it now, that's fine. Well, it's kind of fresh in mind. And we'll pause here for a moment to address, questions that are on your mind. Right now, you can feel free to turn on a mic or raise a hand if you want to address some questions. Patrick, I'm going to just tell you quickly that I think particularly in international schools, your parent community can be just your very best way to start building a database of expertise. International schools tend to have some pretty accomplished folks in the parent community, and also some spouses who might have expertise, but they might have some time to invest in maybe they aren't working right now. Maybe they're the trailing spouse, and they might have some time to use their expertise to work with your students. So I would start with your parent community. Not only what are their areas of expertise, but who do they know? Who else could they bring into the school context? So that's one way to go. And again, you'll be getting that packet, as Ed has said. I'd like to take just a moment to see if there are any questions about today's conversation or things that you want to share. I'm going to close with one final reflection that I want to ask you to do. But before we do that, Any questions about what we've talked about today, or things you want to share that came out of your breakout room that you think the rest of the group ought to hear? Feel free to just turn on your mic if there's something you feel like you'd like to say, or use the chat if you want to communicate that way. Either questions or just ahas or.
Hi, Suzie.
Hi.
Hi. So one of the, I guess, challenges, this might be something that could be addressed maybe next week, was just e-learning. How do you have cross projects or whatnot with other classes or other subject heads when you're doing stuff online? Because in Hong Kong right now, we're faced with that challenge where we're doing online learning. So how do you collaborate in that regard to create projects?
Fantastic question. And that's one of the things that we'll talk about next week, I promise, because it's, it's where a lot of schools are right now. And I think that the challenge is, at least what I'm hearing from a lot of my teacher friends, is they're really worried about making sure we catch up and cover those learning losses. But you also want to make sure that you're going to make some learning gains and that you're keeping students really engaged, that they see themselves as problem solvers. And then that's not something that goes away because we have to work on rebuilding vocabulary we missed, or math skills that we missed. So how can we kind of do both and? And I'll share some strategies I've seen that have used e-learning and blended learning effectively to keep this kind of spirit of students as problem solvers alive and well, despite the pandemic. And sometimes the projects students have taken on have been directly related to the pandemic, thinking about how can we navigate all of this. Any other questions for today? And again, please add that to the Padlet so that I'm sure to come back to that. And I'm going to share with you, we talked about what's ahead next week, but I'm going to share with you one last reflection. I mentioned reflection is just built into project-based learning. So I'm going to practice what I preach and ask you to use the 3 whys protocol to respond to any one of these 3 whys in the chat, if you would. Why might this kind of learning matter for your students? I'm sorry. Why might it matter to me? Why might it matter to my students and our community? And why might it matter to the wider world? Let's use that as our final reflection. And I really look forward to, reviewing the Padlet, seeing what sorts of questions you're wrestling with. E-learning is a great one, but I'm sure that there are others. And so let's hear your final reflections. And I really look forward to working with you next week and hope the resources that you'll be getting are useful and give you something to dig into a little bit and push your thinking. So I'm going to just be quiet for a minute and enjoy your comments. Keeps it real, Patrick. I love that. And authenticity, it's just built right in. It's just some great comments here. I really appreciate your thoughtfulness. So many of you are thinking about student engagement, and that's just the very best reason to consider shifting to project-based learning. It's just, without engagement, it's really hard to go anywhere with your students, right? We know it can be a long slog if they're not engaged. And they've been through a lot in the last couple of years. So finding ways to keep them motivated, keep them involved. And as Greg says, the world needs them for so many reasons, right? These are just great. Beautiful reflections. I'm going to save this chat so that I can enjoy reviewing these later. Wonderful. Just keep them coming. If there's more that you want to say, feel free to add them here. Otherwise, I know you guys have a weekend ahead of you. Enjoy your Saturday. It's Friday night for me here in Portland, Oregon. So I'm going to enjoy some sunshine this weekend and really look forward to connecting with you all this same time next week. And we're going to dig into some of those challenges. And that's a real part of real world learning too. We have to acknowledge the challenges and strategically think about how do we overcome them. So thanks so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to continuing. Back to you, Ed.
Thank you so very much. This was really informative and helpful, and I'm really looking forward to next week. Thank all of you for finding time to join us, and I wish you all the very, very best in the upcoming days, and hope we see you next Saturday morning. For that, I'm going to stop the recording and send everybody home. Thanks so much. Have a good weekend.
Wonderful. I'm trying to save the chat.